Okay, our second briefing is for the group that was advised by Professor Degnan, and it's for the Port Authority. And your colleague here, Vincent, is going to give you a presentation and demonstrate how to do it without a script.
Where's the clicker? Hi, good morning, everyone. As most of you hopefully know by now, my name is Vincent, not Tetsu. So today I'll be presenting on behalf of our group, who will be talking about our time with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey for the past couple of months. So as a quick agenda of what I'll talk about today, we'll go through our project background, our methodology, what we found, and our key recommendations for the Port Authority. So just as a quick recap of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, they provide infrastructure across air, maritime, rail, and auto transport in the New York and New Jersey region. And more notably, they operate the 5 airports in the area. So that's Newark, JFK, LaGuardia, and Teterboro and Stewart, which we all know exist. And we also have they're also a very sustainably conscious organization. They're the first US public transportation agency to fully embrace the climate accords, and that's also reflected through their sustainability commitments, which is to have a target of net zero by 2050. So that brings us to our client Ask, which is ESP alumnus Calder Orr. So people do get jobs from our program. Who asked us to evaluate the viability of renewable diesel as an immediate transition fuel that the Port Authority can use for their ground support equipment until achieving net zero. And that's with the end goal of electrification throughout the entire process in mind. So what do I mean by ground support equipment? So GSEs is anything that at least the Port Authority defines as operation vehicles that help support the airports that run on tarmac. So anything from pushback tractors to baggage carriers to the stair chairs and all that kind of stuff. So, and the Port Authority's GSEs actually are quite a huge emitter. In 2022, they emitted 250,000 metric tons of CO2. And while that might only constitute 6% of the Port Authority's overall aviation emissions, that's still the equivalent of 59,000 passenger vehicles being driven for 1 year. So clearly something has to be done to that if they want to meet their drastic changes in their climate commitments. But if the end goal is to electrify everything, we might be asking, why don't we just spend money investing in electrification now? Like, why waste money on the transition? Well, there's actually a lot of barriers that stop us from doing that overnight. And first of all, there's just not a lot of the technology that is available right now, especially for heavier EVs. They just don't have commercially available options. So unless Elon makes electric snowplows and stair carriers in the next few years, that's going to be really hard. And the ones that are here are quite expensive for a lot of the tenants to bear the brunt costs right now. There's also a lot of logistical challenges to all of this. So if you thought charging a Tesla was hard in New York, imagine that with 10,000 of these things across 5 airports and charging between all these tenants, that's a complete logistical nightmare. And electrical infrastructure is also not really there for a lot of these airports yet. So that's a lot of substations in these airports. And also having to deal with the increased demand of all these airports is not something that can be overlooked. And the grid can provide overnight. So that'll take a lot of time. So with that in mind, our group reviewed over 30 literature sources. We interviewed over 16 experts across the airport authority tenants, GSE provider distributors, and we also analyzed a lot of Port Authority data provided to us from their GSE inventory. And we segmented our key findings into 3 parts in terms of the environmental impact, infrastructure concerns, and the financial costs of integrating renewable diesel to the Port Authority's operations. So in terms of environmental impact, with the Port Authority's GSE data we were able to get our hands on, we calculated that even without renewable diesel adoption, GSEs will emit around 2 million metric tons of CO2 in their lifetime. And if we were to adopt 100% of this, this would be able to reduce GSE emissions by 49%, and even by 50% would be able to reduce GSE emissions by 26%. So clearly in terms of emissions, renewable diesel can clearly help reduce them in terms of GSE's direct emissions. But environmental externalities and impact go way beyond just emissions because there's a lot of varying feedstocks that go into renewable diesel because it comes with biomass. They also have varying environmental impacts. So soybean oils can reduce emissions by 40%, where cooking oil can reduce up to 80% in some cases. And there's also environmental complications of specific feedstocks like palm oil. So we have to be wary of that. And there's also competition of edible crops and implications to that because a lot of companies will be producing feedstocks for commercial use instead of for consumption, which could impact food security as food prices might increase. And there's also environmental concerns with the land use and production that will be needed for a lot of this feedstock production. So that leads us to our first recommendation. If we figured out that some feedstocks have worse environmental externalities than others, we should stipulate which allowed feedstocks within the supply contract with distributors to minimize the overall negative externalities. So if we know that cooking oil is more better at reducing emissions, they should stipulate use cooking oil. Don't use soybeans or palm oil because we know that's bad. And in terms of infrastructure, we've tackled it from two parts, from the production and the distribution end. In terms of production, I hope you can see that, but there's just not a lot in the area for New York right now, and there aren't really plans in the near future. And that makes it a lot harder for renewable diesel to compete with petroleum diesel, which is just so readily available here. And whilst the production really isn't happening in the New York, New Jersey region, there's a lot of distributors, and that's through Sprague, Approved Oil, and Global Partners. And through our research, we found that they have existing capacity within these distribution networks to meet the demand for the GSC fleet of the Port Authority. So clearly there is something that can be built upon here. And that leads us to our second recommendation, is that the Port Authority should utilize the existing renewable diesel distribution infrastructure that already has capacity to provide renewable diesel for Northeast clients. So we can build on something that's already, we know works and is distributing renewable diesel around the area, and can further make sure we don't waste resources starting from scratch. That leads us to financial. So after analyzing a lot of the New York, New Jersey contracts right now, renewable diesel is currently priced at around a 60% price premium compared to petroleum diesel, and that's mainly due to higher logistical costs that come to the absence of regional production, as I mentioned, and the lack of policy mechanisms and incentives that bring the price of petroleum diesel down to around the same price as renewable diesel. So that leads us to our third recommendation, is that the Port Authority should find some kind of way to combine tenant demand to minimize the overall price differential of renewable diesel over petroleum diesel to make the financial cost a lot easier for tenants to bear as they transition to renewable diesel. So that leads us to our overall recommendation to what our client asked. Then yeah, I think it's quite easy to conclude that adopting renewable diesel as a transition fuel can substantially decrease greenhouse gas emissions as GSCs move towards zero emissions. But just as a quick recap of our overall recommendations to minimize negative externalities and make sure this actually is feasible going forward, the Port Authority should stipulate allowed feedstocks to minimize environmental externalities. They should utilize the existing diesel distribution infrastructure to make sure that they're not starting from scratch. And they should somehow combine tenant demand for renewable diesel to make it cheaper for the overall financial cost. And so how can the Port Authority actually implement all of this? So for preliminary steps, we recommend that the Port Authority reconcile internally and make sure that this is all feasible. So they can do that through organizing internal workshops and evaluating the feasibility of incorporating it into their zero emission rule. And the immediate strategy, the Port Authority should establish a consortium for collective procurement and have that and bring that to the renewable diesel supply contractors to try to get an overall better financial terms as they have a more aggregate demand. And in the longer term, the Port Authority should utilize its position to advocate with and behalf of tenants to increase renewable diesel availability. And these are the recommendations that we'll be providing to the Port Authority this Friday. So thank you once again to our team, especially our managers and Professor Dugden, who made all this possible. And I'm now open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I was just wondering, is there any other examples in the US or in other parts of the world that have taken on such a process, and how comparable is this to those ones?
Yeah, so the San Diego Airport has already done this. They have integrated renewable diesel into around 30% of their operations, and they plan on doing that next year. But what's really stopping New York right now is because there's not a lot of policy mechanisms that make the price of petroleum diesel around the same price as renewable. Because in California right now, it's only around 2% more expensive because of the, wow, this, where is it? Yeah, because they have policies like the low carbon fuel standard that bring the price of petroleum basically around the same price. Yeah, and that's been a lot easier for them to integrate.
Thanks for this presentation. This was really interesting. I was curious, you mentioned that renewable diesel is not produced in the Northeast, and I was wondering if your analysis or how your team thought about the potential emissions related to transporting renewable diesel to the Northeast and how that affects the emissions reductions that the Port Authority could achieve through using renewable diesel.
Yeah, so a lot of it right now is transported in, and to overall reduce carbon emissions, they should find more less carbon intensive ways into doing that. So we did look into, I think trains was more less carbon emission intensive than trucks, which a lot of them are using right now. So yeah.